The day I found out my husband of 11 years had forged my signature on a legal document that transferred our entire company. My company, the one I built from a single laptop on a kitchen table, into his name alone, I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I stood in the middle of our marble-floored hallway holding the certified letter from a lawyer I had never heard of, and I felt something ice-cold and very, very clear settle into my bones. Good day, listeners. It's Diana Mercer here. Before I continue, like and subscribe to this channel to hear how I turned my absolute rock bottom into an empire. And leave your comment below because trust me, by the time this story is done, you are going to have something to say. Now, let me take you back. My name is Diana Mercer. At 38 years old, I was co-founder, creative director, and the actual beating heart of Mercer & Vale Creative, a boutique branding and communications agency that had, in 7 years, gone from a 2-person operation running out of my spare bedroom in Portland, Oregon, to a firm with 22 employees, a full roster of mid-sized corporate clients, and a reputation that had started to ripple outward into the national market. We had just been shortlisted for a regional business award. Our revenue for the previous fiscal year had cleared $2.4 million. The Vale in Mercer & Vale was my husband, Thomas Vale. Tall, handsome in a bland, forgettable way, the kind of man who wore his confidence like a rented suit, convincing from a distance, but up close you could see the seams. Tom had joined the company in year 2 when I needed someone to handle client relations and business development while I focused on the creative work. He was charming with clients, excellent at golf, absolutely mediocre at everything else. But I loved him, or I thought I did. I loved the idea of building something with someone. I loved the shared dinners where we talked about the business, the late nights reviewing contracts side by side, the sense that our lives and our work were woven together into something meaningful and permanent. I was in retrospect in love with a partnership that only existed in my imagination. Tom was in love with the income, for at least 3 years before the end. 3 years, listeners. I have since confirmed this with financial forensics, and a very thorough private investigator, Tom, had been systematically positioning himself. He cultivated relationships with our biggest clients independently, making sure they associated him with the company's success rather than me. He began holding meetings I wasn't invited to. He started referring to the agency in emails and casual conversations as his company. And all the while, he was sleeping with Renata Voss. Renata was our head of accounts, 31 years old, with a talent for making you feel seen when she looked at you and absolutely gutted when she looked away. I had hired her myself. I had mentored her. I had given her a salary increase 2 years in a row because she was, on paper, exceptional at her job. What she was also doing off paper was helping Tom build a legal case to push me out. Here's how they did it. I want you to understand the mechanics of this because it wasn't sloppy or impulsive. It was meticulous. Tom had consulted with a corporate attorney, not ours, a different one I had never met, about 12 months before the letter arrived. He and Renata had quietly identified a clause in our original partnership agreement, one I had drafted years ago in good faith, that gave either partner the right to petition for a forced buyout in the event of demonstrated operational mismanagement by the other party. They had spent months manufacturing evidence of my supposed mismanagement, misfiled documents, a client complaint that I later discovered Tom himself had orchestrated by deliberately bungling a deliverable on a project he handled without my knowledge, and a series of internal emails sent from my account because Tom had access to my laptop because I had been foolish enough to trust my husband that made me look erratic and unresponsive. They also had a forged signature. My signature on a document I had never seen, authorizing a restructuring of the company's equity that reduced my share to a minority position. When the forced buyout petition came through, the offer they were legally obligated to make for my minority stake was catastrophic. It was less than $90,000 for a company worth over $3 million. And the letter was served on a Thursday morning while Tom was on a business trip, which I later confirmed was a weekend in Napa with Renata, so I couldn't even confront him face to face. Just me, the marble hallway, the ice in my bones, and a lawyer's letterhead that smelled like the end of everything. I called my personal attorney within the hour. She was wonderful, brisk, and honest. She said we could fight it, and she believed we had grounds to fight it, but that litigation of this complexity would take years and cost money I did not currently have access to, because Tom had also quietly, over the previous 6 months, moved a significant portion of our joint personal savings into an account that was solely in his name. He had left me with access to checking account that held just under $12,000. I had $12,000, no income, a mortgage on a house I couldn't afford alone, and a company I had built with my own hands being legally wrestled away from me by a man who had never once, not once, generated a single original creative idea in his entire life. I gave my attorney a retainer of $5,000. I put the house on the market, and then I sat on the floor of my home office, the same room where I had started the company, on a folding table with a 6-year-old MacBook and a dream, and I let myself cry for exactly 1 hour. I set a timer on my phone. I cried hard, the ugly, gasping kind that makes your whole ribcage hurt. I cried for the marriage that wasn't real. I cried for Renata because the betrayal from her cut differently, more personally, in the way that only women can wound other women. I cried for the 7 years of 80-hour weeks and missed vacations and creative decisions made at midnight, and the clients I had genuinely loved serving. When the timer went off, I washed my face, I made coffee, and I opened my laptop and started researching cities. I needed to go somewhere nobody knew me, somewhere big enough that I could be invisible while I rebuilt, somewhere with an economy and an industry base that could absorb someone with my skills, and somewhere far enough away from Portland that running into Tom Vale at the grocery store was not a risk I would ever have to manage. The choice was obvious. It was the only choice, really, for a woman who needed to disappear into the crowd and simultaneously make herself impossible to ignore. New York City. I arrived at JFK on a Tuesday in November with one large suitcase, a carry-on, $1,100 in cash, a laptop that was 2 years old but still functional, a portfolio of work I had spent a week carefully curating, and a contact name scrawled on a Post-it note from a former colleague who'd moved to Manhattan 3 years prior. That was everything. That was my new beginning. The apartment I'd found online was a studio in Astoria, Queens, 650 square feet, a radiator that knocked every night at 2 in the morning, like a small, bad-tempered ghost, and a window that faced directly into the brick wall of the next building. It was $300 cheaper per month than the cheapest thing I'd found in Manhattan, and at that point, $300 was the difference between groceries and not groceries. I didn't allow myself to be sad about it. I refused. Every time the wave of grief or panic tried to rise, I made myself do something productive. Research a potential client, update my LinkedIn, draft a pitch, learn something new. I had always been a worker. It was the one thing I knew how to do when everything else fell apart. My first 6 weeks in New York were objectively brutal. I applied for freelance creative director positions, consulting gigs, contract branding work, anything that would generate income and build a network in a city where I was a complete unknown. I had a strong portfolio and legitimate credentials, but I was competing against a dense, hyper-connected market where most hiring happened through relationships, and I had none. The rejections were swift, mostly silent, and thoroughly demoralizing. I picked up a part-time project through a small design studio in Brooklyn that paid well below my normal rate. I took it. I picked up a one-off brand refresh for a restaurant in the East Village, referred to me by my Astoria contact. I took that too. I worked on everything simultaneously, often through the night, fueled by coffee and a particular brand of fury that I had learned to treat as a renewable energy source. It was during this period that I made a decision that would change everything. I started a Substack newsletter. It was called The Rebuild, and it was exactly what it sounded like. Every week, I wrote an honest, unvarnished account of what it felt like to rebuild a professional identity from scratch in midlife after a catastrophic loss. I wrote about the mechanics of the betrayal without naming names, with enough specificity that anyone who had been through something similar would recognize their own experience in it. I wrote about the financial realities, the emotional ones, the practical strategies, the failures, the tiny wins. Within 3 months, The rebuild had 11,000 subscribers. Within 5 months, it had 46,000. People were sharing it in their networks, in professional Facebook groups, in private women's forums. I started getting speaking inquiry emails. I started getting consulting inquiry emails from women who had survived similar situations and wanted advice on rebuilding their professional lives. I started getting emails from media outlets wanting to interview me. I did some of those interviews carefully with my attorney's guidance without naming Tom or Renata directly. The litigation was still ongoing, but with enough truth in them that anyone paying attention could feel the weight of what I had survived. I also, during those months, did something I had never done in my career at Mercer and Vail, because Tom had always steered us towards safe, stable corporate clients and away from what he called my risky instincts. I started developing a framework, a methodology, a proprietary approach to brand positioning for companies in transition. Companies that were reinventing themselves, pivoting, restarting after a crisis. It drew on everything I had learned building Mercer and Vail, everything I had studied since arriving in New York, and I will be transparent about this, everything I was living through in real time. I called the framework the Phoenix Protocol, and I was quietly, obsessively building it into a business. I had a concept, I had a growing platform. What I still needed was capital, credibility in the New York market specifically, and ideally a mentor who understood this particular industry at the highest level. I was going to have to make that happen myself. Nobody was going to hand it to me. That was fine. I had never expected anything to be handed to me. The event where I met Elias Okafor was a panel discussion on brand evolution at a branding industry conference held at a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. I had gotten in on a press credential, courtesy of the small industry publication that had agreed to run a piece I pitched them in exchange for conference access. I was not a featured speaker. I was not a sponsor. I was sitting in the back row with a notebook doing the journalism, quietly taking notes. Elias Okafor was the keynote speaker. If you've been in the brand strategy and communications world for any length of time, you know the name. Founder and chairman of Okafor Group, one of the most influential brand consulting firms in the country with offices in New York, London, and Singapore, multiple industry awards, a reputation for being formidably intelligent, fiercely opinionated about the work, and, by multiple accounts I had heard in the industry, deeply, genuinely allergic to pretension and mediocrity. He was 53 years old, Nigerian-American, and had the particular kind of command in a room that doesn't come from height or volume or aggressive body language, but from absolute, unshakable certainty about what he knows. He talked about brand evolution not as a marketing exercise, but as an act of institutional courage. He talked about the companies he had refused to work with and why. He talked about the difference between a brand that is performing recovery and a brand that is actually transforming. I was writing as fast as I could, not for the article, for myself. After the keynote, during the cocktail reception, I was at the edge of the room, revising my notes, when the situation arose that would, in retrospect, change the entire trajectory of what came next. A woman near the drinks table knocked a full glass of red wine directly onto the jacket of the man next to her, who turned out to be Elias Okafor. It was spectacular. The wine went down the full front of his shirt. The woman was horrified. He was remarkably calm. I happened to be 3 feet away, and I happened to have in my bag, because I always have in my bag, out of a combination of preparedness and low-grade anxiety about public appearances, a small portable stain removal pen. I produced it. I offered it. He looked at me for a brief moment with what I can only describe as appraising surprise, and he said, "Well, you're prepared." And I said, without thinking, "I've learned the hard way that you always need to be ready to manage the unexpected mess." He laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one. We started talking, not as fan and keynote speaker, as two professionals who found each other immediately. Genuinely interesting. I told him I was a brand strategist. He asked about my work. I told him honestly about the framework I was building. I was direct about where I was in the process, not falsely modest about what I had, not pretending to be more established than I was. I told him I had a strong methodology and a growing platform, and I was in the process of building the operational infrastructure to take it to market. He asked a series of questions that told me he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk. He asked about the specific industries I was targeting. He asked about how I differentiated the Phoenix protocol from existing frameworks in the market. He asked what I had learned about the New York market specifically coming from outside. I answered everything directly. At the end of the conversation, which had run almost 40 minutes, he handed me his card, a plain white card with only his name and email address on it, and said he'd be interested in seeing the full framework documentation when I had it ready. I want to be precise about what that meant and what it didn't mean. It was not a job offer. It was not a business partnership proposal. It was an invitation to continue a conversation with someone who had clearly decided I was worth his time, which in his world was a meaningful thing to offer. I understood exactly how to receive it as an opportunity I would have to earn. I went home on the subway that night, and I sat in my small apartment with the radiator knocking, and I felt, for the first time in months, something other than fear. I felt the particular electric charge of possibility, of a door cracked open, just barely, just enough to let some light through. I wrote for 6 hours straight. The framework documentation that I sent to Elias Okafor 3 weeks later was the most polished, rigorous, fully realized piece of strategic thinking I had ever produced in my career. He responded within 48 hours. He said, and I have this email saved, that the framework was one of the more original pieces of strategic methodology he had encountered in years, and that he would like to meet for lunch. That lunch was the beginning of a mentorship relationship that was also, I want to be careful how I describe this, a genuine friendship between professional equals who operated at different altitudes. Elias did not take me on as a charity project. He was not interested in rescuing me. What he was interested in, and he told me this explicitly, which I deeply appreciated, was in seeing what someone with my particular combination of skills and lived experience would build if she had the right support and space. He introduced me to people in his network. He advised me on structuring the business. He pushed back hard on the aspects of my pitch that he thought were weak, and he told me why in precise and sometimes uncomfortable detail, and then he expected me to revise and come back stronger, and I always did. He was not gentle when he thought I was wrong. He was also unfailingly respectful of my intelligence and my instincts when he thought I was right. Through his network, I connected with an angel investor group that focused on women-led businesses in the service sector. I went through their process. It was rigorous and, at times, humbling, but I had spent my whole life preparing for exactly this kind of scrutiny, even if I hadn't known it. I came out the other side with a seed investment of $400,000. I incorporated the business in New York. I hired my first 2 team members, a junior strategist I found through a posting at NYU's business school, and a project manager who had been following the Rebuild newsletter and reached out to ask if I needed help. I signed a lease on a small but respectable office space in a building in the Flatiron District. I built out the operational structure. The business was called Mercer Phoenix. People sometimes asked if the Phoenix was a coincidence. It was not. And then, just as things were accelerating, just as the first real clients were signing on, just as the business was beginning to breathe and move and take on its own weight and momentum, Portland came to New York. I should have been better prepared for it. In retrospect, the signs were there. I had started getting some unusual attention on my Substack. Not the usual supportive comments, but a smattering of critical ones, not quite trolling but pointed, skeptical, oddly specific in the way they questioned my credentials and my version of events. I noticed it. I flagged it mentally. I didn't yet understand what it meant. The litigation back in Portland was still grinding forward. My attorney had found compelling evidence of the signature forgery and was preparing our case. Tom and his lawyer knew this. The momentum of the case had shifted. Tom was looking at potential criminal exposure, not just a civil dispute, and Renata, who had been subpoenaed, was starting to look nervous. I found out later, through a source I will not name because I am not interested in the legal complexity of naming her, that it was Renata who suggested the campaign. She was the strategist in the end. Tom was just the money and the malice. The plan was this. Mercer Phoenix had been building toward a significant milestone, a formal launch event that we were planning as a combination of client showcase, investor presentation, and industry party intended to announce our first full year of operations, our client results, and our upcoming expansion into the UK market. We had rented a beautiful space in Soho. We had invited a select list of 250 guests, current clients, prospective clients, members of the investment community, industry press, and several of Elias's contacts who were attending as a gesture of professional respect. The event was 10 days away when the story appeared. It ran on a mid-level business gossip blog that I won't name, but that a certain subset of the branding and PR industry reads with disproportionate attention. The headline was something along the lines of, "The brand strategist who stole her own story, serious questions about Diana Mercer's claims," and what followed was a carefully constructed hit piece. It alleged that I had exaggerated or fabricated my role in the success of Mercer and Vail. It quoted anonymous sources, which I immediately recognized from the specificity of certain details, as Tom and Renata, claiming that I had been a figurehead creative director whose contributions were largely cosmetic, that the real strategic and operational work had been done by Tom Vail, and that my current business narrative, specifically my story of rebuilding from scratch after a betrayal, was a calculated fiction designed to generate sympathy and investor interest. It also, and this part was clever and genuinely ugly, suggested that my relationship with Elias Okafor was not professional mentorship, but a strategic personal entanglement, implying without saying directly that I had used a romantic relationship with him to gain access to his network. That last part was a lie so vicious and so deliberate that when I read it I had to put my phone down and walk around the block 3 times. Elias called me within 30 minutes of the article going up. He had been reached for comment by the blogger and had declined, but he had seen the piece. He was calm in the way that very powerful people can be calm in a crisis, not because they're not angry, but because they've learned that rage is a resource and you don't waste it. He said, "Tell me what you need from me," and when I said, "Not yet, give me 24 hours." He said, "Taken." I called my attorney in Portland. Then I called a media attorney I had been quietly introduced to several months earlier. Someone who had been recommended by a journalist in my network and with whom I had an existing relationship, though I had hoped never to need her in this capacity. Then I sat down at my desk and I started to work. Here is what Tom and Renata did not know, because they had been operating on their own assumptions about me for so long that they had stopped paying attention to who I had actually become. I had been documenting everything since the day I walked out of the marble hallway in Portland, not just for the litigation, from the very beginning, when I still didn't fully understand what I was dealing with. I had an instinct, the same instinct that had made me a good strategist, the ability to read a situation before it was fully legible that told me to keep records. I had saved emails. I had preserved records of my creative contributions to Mercer and Vail in painstaking detail. Client correspondence, original brief documents, design files with metadata timestamps, contracts with my signature, internal communications that showed the agency's creative decisions originating with me. I had built a chronological archive that would have made a forensic accountant weep with joy. And the rebuild, my newsletter, 46,000 subscribers who had been reading for months, the documented, dated, real-time account of my experience. The newsletter had timestamps. It had consistency. It contradicted the narrative of a woman fabricating a victim story in ways that were verifiable by any journalist who cared to look. Beyond that, I had 46,000 subscribers, many of whom were professional women in business, media, and communications. When things like this happen, coordinated smear campaigns, they depend on the target being isolated and caught off guard and lacking a platform to respond. I was none of those things. I did not release anything immediately. I let the story sit for a carefully calculated 40 hours, during which I watched it circulate, made note of who shared it and who didn't, tracked the comments, and had my media attorney send a formal legal notice to the blog citing specific defamatory claims, particularly the insinuation about my relationship with Elias and demanding a correction and retraction. The blog's legal team responded within 12 hours. They were suddenly much less interested in the story. Then I did something that Tom, who had never truly understood how creative communication works, could not have anticipated. I wrote a Substack post. It was not a defensive post. It was not an angry post. It was a meticulously documented, absolutely devastating post that walked my 46,000 subscribers through the full story, from the forgery and the hostile takeover to my arrival in New York, to the building of Mercer Phoenix, to the coordinated smear campaign with receipts, with timeline documentation, with screenshots of original creative work from Mercer and Vale with metadata showing my authorship, with a link to publicly available court filings that confirmed the forgery allegations my attorney had raised in the Portland litigation, with a statement from Elias Okafor, which he drafted himself in his own voice, unequivocal and complete, that described our professional relationship precisely and called the insinuations in the gossip piece what they were: sexist, defamatory, and false. The post went live 48 hours before the Mercer Phoenix launch event. By the evening before the event, it had been read over 200,000 times. It had been shared in every major business and communications industry forum I knew of. It had been picked up by 2 actual journalists who wanted to write real stories about it. My Substack gained 11,000 new subscribers in a single day, and somewhere in Portland, I imagined, 2 people were beginning to understand what they had walked into: the launch event. I want to tell you about the launch event because it was not what I had expected, and it was everything I had worked for, and it was also the moment that closed a chapter of my life with a definitiveness I had not fully anticipated. The space in Soho was beautiful: exposed brick, high ceilings, warm lighting, our brand identity executed throughout the space in a way that my team had worked on for weeks and that I was deeply proud of. The client work was displayed on a series of mounted panels. There was a cocktail hour, a brief presentation, and then an extended networking period. It was the kind of event I had spent years organizing for other companies, and doing it for my own felt like a homecoming to a home I had never actually lived in before but had always been building toward. Elias was there with 2 members of his team. He shook my hand at the door and said quietly the post was exceptional work. I said, "I learned from a good teacher." He smiled and moved into the room. About an hour into the event, I saw them. I want to be very precise about this because I have replayed it many times and I still find it, in some way, almost incomprehensible. Tom Vale and Renata Voss had flown to New York and physically shown up at my launch event. They had not been invited. They were not on any list. Renata, I later pieced together, had social engineered her way past the door by presenting herself as press using a fabricated credential. Tom had simply walked in with the crowd during a busy arrival window. I saw them across the room, and for a moment, a single, very quiet moment that I allowed myself, I felt the old pull of it, the old hurt, the years of misplaced love, the sense of having been comprehensively deceived by people I had trusted absolutely. It was there, briefly, and then it was gone. I went to find Marcus, my project manager, and I told him calmly that we had uninvited guests and that I wanted security alerted to stand by, but I did not want them removed immediately. I told him I would handle it. He looked at me, knew my tone, and said, "You've got this." I said I knew. Here's what happened. Renata approached me first. I give her a certain grudging respect for that. Even now, it takes a particular kind of nerve to walk up to the person you've helped destroy and introduce yourself at their launch party. She came up beside me during a moment when I was standing slightly apart from a group, reviewing a note on my phone. She said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Diana, congratulations. The event looks beautiful, as if we were colleagues at a conference, as if no history existed between us." I looked at her. I took a slow breath, and I said, "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" She blinked. "It's Renata Voss." I looked at her with the kind of absolute blankness that you can only achieve when you have genuinely, thoroughly, consciously decided that someone no longer occupies any meaningful space in your inner world. "I'm afraid I don't recall," I said. "Are you a client, or did you RSVP through one of our partner channels?" My voice was pleasant, professionally warm. Completely empty. She stared at me for a moment. Diana, I know you recognize me. I'm sorry, I said, tilting my head slightly. This is a private event, and I want to make sure I connect you with the right person. Do you have a business card? I watched the color shift in her face. It is a remarkable thing to watch someone process the realization that the weapon they came to deploy, your own anger, your own wound, your reaction to them, has simply been removed from the room. She had no script for this. She had come expecting a confrontation, maybe a scene, maybe something she could record on her phone and use. She got nothing. She got a woman who looked at her and saw a stranger. "I think you should leave," I said, still in the same pleasant tone. "I'll have someone help you find the exit." I caught the eye of the security team member who was stationed nearby and gave him a small nod. Tom was standing 15 feet away. I know he had watched the exchange because when I turned in his direction, he had the particular posture of a man who has just realized something has gone very wrong. He was still handsome in that bland, forgettable way. He looked, I noticed, tired, and something else, smaller, I think, like a man who had been playing a part in his own story for so long that he'd forgotten it was a story. He started to move toward me. I held up one hand, not aggressively, just a small, clear gesture of stop, and he stopped. "Thomas," I said. My voice was still pleasant, still completely without heat. "This is not a conversation I'm going to have tonight, or any other night," I paused. "You should go. Diana, I just want to—" "I know what you want," I said, "and it doesn't exist here. Nothing you need from me exists here. Goodbye." I turned my back on him. I walked back to my guests. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and I spent the next 45 minutes in a genuinely wonderful conversation with a prospective client from the financial services sector who was interested in discussing the Phoenix Protocol. Behind me, security was completing the removal of 2 people who had come to New York to destroy my evening and found instead that I had nothing left for them, not hatred, not contempt, not even the minor acknowledgement of anger, nothing. I had cauterized the wound so completely that where they expected a scar they found smooth, unmarked skin. The next morning, the coverage was extraordinary. One of the 2 journalists who had reached out after the Substack post had been at the event, not as part of the smear campaign, but because she'd genuinely become interested in the story after reading the post and had asked to come. She was a business writer for a publication that I respected enormously. She had watched the interaction with Tom and Renata from across the room and had been, I found out when she called me the next day, furious on my behalf and simultaneously awestruck by what she described as the coldest, most elegant rebuff I have ever witnessed at a professional event. Her piece ran the following week. It was a full profile, not a brief item, but a long-form profile, headlined something close to the comeback, the story of Mercer Phoenix, the story of what had been done to me in Portland, the story of the launch, the story of what had happened when my ex-husband and his accomplice showed up at the event and were met with a locked door and a polite goodbye. It was genuinely the piece I would have written myself if I'd been telling my own story. The Portland litigation concluded 8 weeks later, earlier than my attorney had projected, partly because the weight of evidence against Tom, including the forensic analysis of the forged signature, which had been confirmed by 3 independent handwriting experts, had made his legal position untenable, and partly, I believe, because the public profile of the case had created pressures that made prolonged fighting too costly. The settlement was significant. It included a financial recovery that went well beyond what a forced buyout at minority rates would have given me. It included a public statement, filed in court records, that acknowledged the forgery. It included Renata's professional credentialing being flagged as part of the legal record, which had implications for her future in the industry. Tom did not go to prison. I had complicated feelings about that for a time. And then I let the complicated feelings go, because I realized that prison was a dramatic ending, but not the ending I actually needed. What I needed, what I had already achieved, was the life I was living. In the 18 months following the launch event, Mercer Phoenix grew at a pace that, I will be honest with you, even I had not fully projected. We brought on 3 more team members. We opened a London satellite office, run by a brilliant woman I recruited who had heard about the Phoenix Protocol through Elias's UK network. We were engaged by clients in financial services, technology, retail, and the nonprofit sector. The Rebuild newsletter became a paid subscription platform with a premium tier that offered live Q&A sessions and a private community forum. I started getting speaking requests from conferences, and I accepted the ones that interested me and declined the ones that didn't, which was a luxury I savored. Elias and I continued to talk regularly. Our relationship evolved into something I find genuinely difficult to describe because it doesn't map neatly onto professional categories. It was not mentorship anymore because the asymmetry of that had dissolved. It was a peer relationship, a friendship, a mutual professional respect between two people who had found each other's company intellectually and personally rewarding. I leave it at that because some things don't need to be made more legible than they are. I moved out of the Astoria apartment and into a place in Brooklyn that had actual windows. I bought a good coffee machine. I took a vacation for the first time in 4 years to the Azores alone because I had reached a point where I was no longer afraid of my own company and I wanted to see what I actually enjoyed when nobody else's preferences were involved. The answer was the ocean, long meals, and reading in the afternoon. Good to know. About 6 months after the launch event, I received a LinkedIn message from Renata. She was no longer at Mercer & Vail. The company, I had heard through the industry grapevine, was struggling significantly without my creative direction and had lost several major clients. Renata was apparently consulting independently and not finding it easy. The message was long. It was written in the tone of someone who had practiced sincerity so thoroughly that they couldn't quite pull it off. It talked about regret. It talked about mistakes. It used the word growth. It ended with an ask, not an explicit ask, but the kind of carefully worded opening that was clearly angling towards some form of professional connection or reference. I read it once. I did not reply. I archived it and moved on. Tom emailed directly, 2 emails, actually 3 months apart. The first was aggressive in an impotent way, threatening to tell his side of the story. I found this moderately entertaining, given that his side of the story was a matter of public legal record and had not been particularly flattering. The second was quieter, more defeated, and contained the word sorry multiple times in ways that convinced me he was sorry, genuinely, in the way that people are sorry when their choices have consequences they didn't adequately calculate. I did not respond to the first email. I did not respond to the second either. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't say better. Not cold, not angry, not performatively indifferent, actually genuinely indifferent in the way that you are indifferent to weather in a country you've left behind. I had not forgiven them, if you're wondering. I want to be precise about that too, because there is a version of this story where the triumphant woman magnanimously forgives her tormentors and that feels spiritually correct and cinematically satisfying, and I'm not going to give you that version because it's not true. I didn't forgive them. I didn't think about them enough to make forgiveness a necessary act. They had become irrelevant to me in the deepest possible sense. Not enemies I needed to defeat, not villains whose downfall I needed to witness, just people who had existed in my past and were no longer present in my present. What I had done, which felt more complete and more true than forgiveness, was let them go. Not release them from accountability. The legal system had handled the accountability piece imperfectly, but with more closure than I'd expected, but released my own attachment to their story. The thing about people who wrong you and then keep trying to get a reaction out of you, even years later, is that they're still trying to be in a relationship with you. The wound, the conflict, the grudge, it's a form of connection and they're addicted to it. The most complete thing you can do is refuse to participate. I refused. I was done participating. 2 years after the launch event, at an industry gala, a proper one, the kind with a serious awards program and a 5-course dinner and a genuinely excellent jazz trio, Mercer Phoenix won an award for innovation in brand strategy. It was not the most prestigious award in the industry. It was not the most newsworthy moment of my career by that point. But I want to tell you about it because of what happened when they called my name. I stood up at the table where I was sitting with my team, 5 of them, including Marcus and the junior strategist from NYU who had been with me almost from the beginning, and I walked to the stage and I stood at the podium with the award in my hand, and I looked out at a room full of people who had watched Mercer Phoenix be built and grow and survive and thrive, and I thought of the marble hallway. I thought of the timer going off after an hour of crying. I thought of the studio apartment in Astoria and the knocking radiator and the $1,100 in cash and the post-it note with a contact's name on it. I thought about what I would say to the woman who had sat on the floor of her office in Portland and set a timer on her phone and cried herself clean. What I said in my acceptance speech was not that. What I said was professional and warm and appropriately brief and genuinely felt. But what I thought was this: you did it. You actually did it. And nobody gave it to you, and nobody saved you, and you did not get rescued. You got up, you packed one bag, you went somewhere you'd never lived, and you started again, and you built it from nothing, and here it is, right here in your hands, and it is yours. It is entirely, completely, permanently yours. There is, I suppose, a version of this story that ends with a grand moral. A lesson, the bow on the package. I'm going to resist that because I think you're smart enough to draw your own conclusions, and I find lessons at the end of a narrative slightly insulting to the audience. What I will tell you is this: the people who try to take things from you are always operating on a specific assumption. They assume that what makes you powerful is the thing they can take. The company, the money, the title, the reputation. They identify the external object and they go for it because it looks like the source. They're always wrong. What makes you powerful is not a thing, it's a practice. It's the disciplined habit of getting up, of working when you don't want to, of staying curious when you're humiliated, of building something when you have almost nothing to build with, of understanding that the worst thing someone can do to you is strip away the scaffolding and leave you with only yourself, and discovering that yourself is enough. That yourself has always been enough. Tom and Renata took the scaffolding. They got the company name and the client list and the savings and the years of equity. They got all of it. What they couldn't take, what they didn't even understand was the practice, the mind, the methodology, the ability to walk into a room of strangers in a city I'd never lived in and build something from nothing. They didn't take that because it wasn't something you can take. It just lives in you. And when everything else falls away, you find out it was the only thing that was ever real. I found that out in a marble hallway in Portland with a certified letter in my hand and ice in my bones. And I have been grateful for it. Grateful, I mean it. Genuinely grateful every single day since. Mercer Phoenix is currently in its 3rd year of operation. We have expanded the London office and are in early conversations about a Singapore presence, which would complete a kind of symmetry I find privately amusing. We have served over 60 clients in 9 industries. The Rebuild newsletter has 112,000 paid subscribers. I'm working on a book. The Phoenix Protocol has been licensed to 3 partner firms. I live in Brooklyn. I have good windows. I have a coffee machine that I love immoderately. I go to the Azores every year alone to see the ocean and eat long meals and read in the afternoon. I have not heard from Tom Vail in over a year. I have not heard from Renata Voss since the LinkedIn message I archived without responding to. I do not know what their lives look like now, and I do not think about it, which is perhaps the final and most complete indicator of how thoroughly the chapter is closed. I think sometimes about what would have happened if they hadn't done what they did. If the letter had never arrived, if I had spent another 5 years running Mercer and Vail with Tom playing an increasingly larger role in a company that was increasingly less mine, if I had never packed the suitcase, if I had never come to New York, if I had never been forced by catastrophic loss to find out what I was actually made of, I genuinely don't know if I would have built this. I genuinely don't know if I would have written the Rebuild, developed the Phoenix Protocol, met Elias, found the team I have now, won the award, had the gala moment, written the book. I think maybe some version of a good life would have continued. I think maybe I would have been fine, but fine was never what I was after. And perhaps the most unsettling, most complicated, most true thing I can say about all of it is this: sometimes the worst thing that has ever happened to you is also in retrospect the most clarifying. Not because suffering is secretly good. It isn't, Suffering is bad and betrayal is cruel, and what was done to me was wrong in ways the legal system can never fully remediate. But because sometimes the only way you ever find out what you're actually capable of is when someone removes every other option and you're left with nothing but the practice, nothing but yourself, and you find out I found out, and here I am. Have you ever found the strength to completely cut out toxic people from your life and watch karma do its job? Or did you feel the need to prove something to them first, to make them see what they lost, to get the last word, to make sure they knew? I want to hear from you. Comment below. I read every single one.